Welcome to the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long term business success is all about maximizing profit, but to do that, you first must optimize your people in a low friction context. So, this series helps bring you people who are out in the real world doing this kind of work on a daily basis. They're people who have something to teach us. Sometimes it's what's working, and sometimes it's what's not working, but it's our opportunity to learn from them. So today, Kit Lisle is our guest, and I'm really excited about this because he functions in a space that we don't get to learn from very often. And he has a company called The Operators. Sounds like a movie title, and it's a strategic growth council of peer advisors. They're C suite people who work in private equity investing companies. And he's spent 24 years with a company called Aclaro that was about growth partners. And I love some of the language in Aclaro's history, where it's about growth strategy and consulting, which is not unusual, but he thinks about it from the standpoint of the mission to clarify and amplify. And one of my favorite words that we underuse is facilitate how to help people make good decisions and grow. So I'm thrilled to have Kit here today and explore the revenue and the revenue culture from a private equity standpoint. So welcome, Kit.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, after, since we met a few weeks ago through My Most Trusted, for those of you out there in the world who don't know what that is, it's worth you exploring a little bit. Um, I've tried to research the things you're doing and are planning to do. So I'd love to have you tell us your history. How did you get here and what is here?
Well, I'm not sure how far back we want to go, but I'll try to provide the quick highlights. I was a military intelligence officer in the Army, and I managed to transition from that world by sort of painting a picture to consulting firms, management or strategy consulting firms, painting a picture about what a tactical battlefield intelligence officer does. And in my language, it was, hey, we look at a map that's very similar to a market map, and we figure out where our competitors are and what they're doing, and we develop plans to beat them in their markets. Well, that was sort of my way of trying to bridge the gap between the military and corporate strategy, and it worked. I got a job in consulting. I had clients that were that particular consulting firm served mainly, let's say, Global 1000 types of companies, and I remember working on some assignments with some big manufacturing, industrial equipment kinds of companies. At the same time, I worked with a private equity group as a client. And what I remember about that experience, we didn't have too many private equity clients. So it was a little odd. It was a little unusual. They were sort of, not your typical client, but I gravitated towards them because they asked what was then a 28-year-old questions, tough questions. So in other words, all right, Kit, you've finished your assignment, you've done the commercial due diligence or the market due diligence. You've said the market is attractive. You've said the company's well positioned in that market. You've said there's runway for growth. And here comes the tough question. They said, would you do this deal? And I said, well, there's a lot that I don't know about the equation, but I like it. Sure, yes. And then the next question came in, why? So I answered that. And then the next question came in, which was, what would you do differently to help this business grow more rapidly post-close? And so anyway, I really appreciated the banter and the dialogue and the respect that they afforded me. So at some point, a few years later, I created Aclaro Growth Partners. And the focus of Aclaro really, truly, Rick, in the intent was to serve not the private equity deal teams or the boards, the people that make the investment decisions, but rather the CEOs and maybe the CMOs who were running the portfolio companies. Those are the people that I really gravitated towards and wanted to work with. And what I wanted to do was growth strategy, or maybe it's a little bit of value creation or go to market, decision support. So helping people make better decisions about how to grow and where to focus based on fact, ground truth, facts and insights. I said this was going to be a long story, Rick, so I apologize. So the what happened was those CEOs, it turns out, don't necessarily control their own purse strings. So I was a little surprised, but they couldn't really make the decision about whether to hire a consulting firm or not. I suppose if the costs were low enough, it would have been acceptable, but the prices were high enough that they needed the board's buy-in. So when I formed Aclaro, even though I really wanted the clients to be the CEOs of the portfolio companies, the clients effectively became the private equity groups and then later investment banks. So fast forward to today, or maybe 4 years ago, I still had that itch or curiosity, that fascination with the management teams who were running portfolio companies. Those are the people I wanted to work with. So I created the operators, I guess 2 years ago, a couple years after hiring a CEO and a COO to run Aclaro. And the question often comes up, well, how did you arrive at the name, the operators? And I like to tell this story. When a private equity deal team is pleased with their management team, they will refer to them as operators. Our operators are doing a great job. We're really pleased with our operators. We chose our talent well. But when they're displeased, they'll say management. If management can't figure it out, then we'll just fire them and we'll bring in a management team that can. We're not in the business of running companies. We rely on our management team to do that. So when they're happy, they call them operators. So that's why I gravitated towards the operators.pe.
I
And
love
so
it.
I think it might have been you, Rick, who asked about the .pe. So in
Yep.
our case, that stands for private equity, but I think it originally came from Peru opening up their URL or whatever. So anyway, long-winded way of saying that's how we got here today.
Wow. I'm glad you took the longer path because I've got a whole page of notes here just of things we could talk about. We'll never get to all of them, but one of them that I got thinking about this morning in preparation for our talk, and you teed it up beautifully. In our work, when we certify people in how to think or be a chief revenue officer, literally the first thing we talk to them about is let's get clarity about the purpose why your organization exists and how you're approaching running it. And thinking about the two groups you just talked about, the investor group, the PE group, and the people running it. And particularly if the PE group acquires a company and leaves leadership in place, often the companies they acquire could be second generation family businesses, or even if they're new tech, they had some wonderful mission that they started with when they built the technology or when they founded the company. And they have we talk about the difference between big purpose, which is whatever it is you're going to do is going to make the world a better place, maybe because you employ 100 people and they can afford to send their kids to college and they have health care, and you're just a great citizen and you're making your community better. Or it could be your technology is going to change the world, but you have some meaningful purpose behind it. The other form of purpose is the term we use is mercenary. People think about mercenary as a Humvee with a machine gun. That's not what we mean. But I go to places that just had a hurricane and I put roofs on homes. And I am really good at working with insurance companies and bringing a team with trucks full of shingles and nails and all that kind of stuff so I can get roofs on really, really, really fast. And when we put on all the roofs, we go back and play golf. Mercenary on one hand, short term, fulfilling a bubble requirement. And the big purpose is we're really here to build a great company with great teams and great long term partner customers. And my experience is often when I see PEG funded companies, the leadership is thinking big purpose long term, Simon Sinek's term, infinite company. And the PEG is thinking, how can I get this up to flip? And that's very short term mercenary. Is that a real observation or is that me just misinterpreting the facts?
Absolutely correct. So, in a private equity group, in the mindset of the investors, and to be clear, the true investors are called limited partners.
Yep.
So, these are either high net worth individuals or pension plans or institutions who are investing a small piece of their assets into something that would be considered high risk. Those are the true investors, but the people that make the investment decisions are called the general partners. And if they could sell a business only 1 year after acquiring it, they would love to do that because the math, the return on investment just works better the faster you can sell it. So they're
Yep.
motivated to tell their limited partners, their investors, that, hey, the numbers are fantastic for our fund. And it's harder to do that if you stretch out the hold period to
Yep.
7 years or 10 years. So you're absolutely right. And but that brings up another point, which is the mindset of your typical operator. Very high EQ, very high
Yep.
emotional intelligence, very collaborative. Typically, they are knowledgeable, skilled, experienced. They're the right fit for the job. So if they're a CEO, they've typically been a CEO before, and maybe they've even worked in some very large corporations and seen the best practices, kind of the right way to do things. But they know the clock is ticking. They typically only have 3 years or so to get the job done, and then the business is going to be sold. And it's probably worth noting here that there was something that you said that caused me to think of this, Rick. A typical private equity acquisition scenario is, they buy a business, they replace the CEO and the CFO, and typically some other member of the management team, for whatever reason, doesn't make the cut. So they might have to replace a COO or a CMO or CHRO or somebody. Maybe they didn't have a
Yep.
CHRO, they put them in. And that team does a really good job creating value, building the business, increasing profitability, making it more efficient, putting in systems and processes and the right people, doing all the right things under a tremendous amount of stress and pressure from the board. And then they lead the business towards an exit, which requires a lot of planning. And they successfully execute the liquidity event. They get the business
Yep.
sold, and we've done the research. On average, about 40% of that senior team is out of a job within 1 quarter. Now, that's assuming a larger private equity group is the
Yep.
acquirer. It's a
Yep.
little bit less if it's a strategic acquirer. But so 40%. So think about that for a second. So these are very knowledgeable, experienced, skilled, capable, hungry, hard charging, type A personalities who want to work, want to prove themselves, who are
Yep.
sitting, let's say, in the bullpen, waiting for their next rotation. And that's not a really good, efficient use of an asset. And I use that word intentionally. I'm
Yeah.
viewing human capital as an asset. So what we're trying to do is plug in the perfect right fit person into a company and they might play a fractional role or an interim role or a
Yep.
consultant role or maybe just serving as an expert for an expert call. They could be a board member or an operating
Yep.
partner in private equity language. So my point is we're trying to solve for that inefficiency of that many people being placed into the bullpen Not because they did anything wrong,
Right.
not because they're not good, but because the standard operating procedure is, right, we're going to replace the CEO and the
Yep.
CFO. So private equity groups, on the other hand, they don't necessarily want a bigger bench, but I think what they want is bench strength and bench
Yes.
flexibility. And they
Yep.
want the ability to solve problems, to solve the hurdles, obstacles, the friction points, the pain points within portfolio companies that are causing that hold period potentially to extend beyond 3 years. And so if we can figure out a way to put the right person in to speed up that liquidity event or the chance that they can sell it faster by solving a value creation dilemma, that's
Wow.
what we're really all about.
Wow. We could clearly have this podcast go all day. Um, when I think about that, one of the things that comes to mind is uh, partially because this is what we focus on is the context that these people are in. And, our belief is you can never maximize profit unless you've optimized the people, but you'll never optimize the people unless they're in a low friction context that really supports their work. Um, does that model apply in the PE situation?
Yeah, I think it does. When you maybe just elaborate a little bit on low friction and what you mean by that.
Well, one of the things I mentioned earlier, the first thing, if we were working with a client, we would be talking about their purpose. The second thing we'd be talking about is how do you take that purpose and create what we call a revenue strategy. And a revenue strategy is a very specific thing and has 5 questions and 5 answers, and those 5 answers are either deployable and executable or they're not. And if they are deployable and executable, then by definition they're scalable. And if you don't have those 5 questions answered, by definition, what you're doing is random and it isn't scalable. And, you have not replaceable parts, but, every part's uniquely crafted. And so when we think about low friction, it starts with we all know where we're going and we all know what's necessary to deploy and execute. That's internally and externally, because often we have external partners that are necessary components. So when we say low friction, that means we bring people in and they can go to work because they don't have to create all that stuff on a random basis daily.
Well said. We're aligned, Rick, but let me give you a scenario. Hypothetically, let's say you and I work for, I don't know, we'll say an industrial manufacturing business, and maybe you're the COO and I'm the CFO, and we report to Bill. And Bill founded the company 45 years
Yep.
ago. Okay. So Bill is, I don't know, approaching 80. And if we have a question about something in the company, we go to Bill.
Yep.
Why do we go to Bill? Because Bill's run, every role there is to be responsible for. He's the founder. He was a company of one at one point, and he's the expert. So if there's ever a conflict or a dilemma or a challenge, Bill has the answer. So we just go to Bill, right? And you and I wake up one day, we go to work, and there's an announcement. Hey, we sold the company. Meet your new board of directors. They're private equity. So the culture at that moment is going to change more rapidly and more profoundly than either you or I could even fathom.
Yep.
So private equity culture shock comes into play. Imposter syndrome comes
Yep.
next. So it's a long-winded way of saying private equity, at the lower end of the middle market, private equity kind of breaks into
Yep.
three big buckets: the lower middle market, and then very large private equity groups that buy relatively large companies. In the lower middle market, they're typically buying a company that was founder led. It's
Hmm.
your quintessential family business. And those typical family businesses are not run as well as I think you would suggest that they be run. In other words, there's a bottleneck and it's the founder. The
Yep.
founder makes every decision and everybody kind of reports to him and just asks him what to do. So that changes really, really quickly when private equity
Yep.
steps in. But just wanted to acknowledge that there are a lot of businesses that are making a profit that exists in the United States that are really not that well run. And that's not necessarily a slap on, I'm not intending to be disrespectful to those business owners, but maybe they're making enough money that they don't
Yeah.
really need to worry about systems, processes, people, technology. We have 11 value creation levers, and we don't I'll pause there before I start another ramble.
Well, no, this is your experiences and ours are very, very similar. Um, in our world, we're there to help maximize the possible profits based on the resources you're willing to risk to get there. And a lot of CEOs at the point they have, two houses, a boat, a plane, and their kids are all the way through school and graduate school. They don't sit there and think, I need to get that much better. I need to make that much more money, or I need to take on more risk. And they're saying, I'm really pretty happy with where I am right now. So don't expect I'm going to invest a lot of time, energy, and emotion into change. And I'm assuming when a private equity company comes in, they kind of redefine, what our mission is and our risk tolerance is, and our metrics are going to be. So I think what you're describing is exactly the same thing that we find all the time.
Yeah, it sort of brings up another point that's worth mentioning for your audience's sake, and that is, if you're running a business and you're in that category of, hey, we're making enough profit, life's challenging enough, I don't necessarily need to be following best practices and maximize the efficiency of my company. I'm not worried about it. That's fine in a literal day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year sense. But maybe what you're not thinking about is, let's just assume the business generates $1 million in cash flow, $1 million of EBITDA. If you were following the right processes, systems, technologies, people, or the recommendations of what the ways to maximize the value of the business, and hypothetically, you could get it from $1 million a year to, say, 1.5 million, right? We're not going crazy, but the difference that $500,000 makes, if you assume a multiple of earnings, let's just be conservative and say the multiple of earnings is only six, because it's a small business. So six times 500,000, that's $3 million that you're giving up when you go to sell it. And I don't think a lot of business owners think about it that way. You're not necessarily improving the business for the day to day. You're also improving it so that when there is a payday, when you go to sell it, you're maximizing it there. And last thing I'll say on the topic is there are some private equity investors that would look at that company and say, there's an awful lot of upside there. There is a clear path to growth. This is really exciting. We can make so many improvements. But there's another set of private equity investors that would look at that business and say, wow, that is not a well-run company. That is not attractive to us. So you're doing yourself a favor in many ways by improving the way it's run and removing those friction points, as you put it.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. One of the things you mentioned in your introduction was about the value transfer, and one of the things we both are familiar with Vistage, and I speak to Vistage groups frequently. And one of the questions I ask CEOs is, how much time do you spend in a week focused on what you and your company are going to do to transfer more value that the market will gladly pay you for? And as of yet, I haven't found one CEO that thinks about that ever. They're actively involved in tactical day-to-day kinds of things to get through the week. And when we think about how you create um, new customers, keep the old customers, uh, manage your business, we think about value transfer. And value transfer, somebody will gladly pay you for. And is that, does that have a play, a conscious, intentional play in the work you do?
It absolutely does, for sure. One way to think about it is every business exists to solve a problem for a customer. Period. That's the reason that you exist, or that's the purpose, at least from the customer side. And if a number of customers have the attitude and mindset that, well, they could go to our company, or they could go to the other company, or they could go to the company down the street, and they're all pretty much the same, and they all kind of do the same thing. Well, that's borderline commodity, right? That's not a real fun place to be. So I think what you're getting at is what businesses really should be focused on is how can you solve that problem in such a unique and thoughtful manner that you appear to be the only game in town, the only option that a client has. And the way to do that is to focus, to be the best at something specific. And that could be, you know, service or relationship, or maybe it's price, or maybe it's quality.
Mhm.
Maybe it's in a specific industry, not only vertical, but in a very,
Yep.
very narrow range. Maybe it's for a particular type of customer in that industry. Maybe it's in a particular
Yeah.
geography. So, the more laser focused you can get, the more likely it is that a customer looks at you and says, I like what they do. They do it for me. They exist
Yeah.
for me, and I don't know anybody else that does what they do. And that's how you make a business more profitable.
Yeah. I'm just imagining one of the things uh, when we certify people in how to do this, one of the first things we ask is, are you there to make money from your customer or with your customer? And it kind of defines what we talk about as, do you run your business from the buyer's frame of reference back to headquarters or from headquarters out? And when companies run headquarters out, they're typically trying to convince buyers to do whatever headquarters wants them to do, as opposed to understanding that niche and that specific situation you were just describing and creating the offer that the buyer says, where the heck have you been all these years? I've been dealing with this for decades and can't fix it. Now you're here. This is great. Um, so when we talk about that low friction context, that's one of the elements of that low friction context. If you identified from the buyer's frame of reference, we call it buyer back, what's really compelling to them that they're willing to pay much more than cost plus or how people typically price things. Is that, it sounds like that's what you were talking about exactly.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And to get there, to really understand the customer's point of view, perspective, and needs, you have to ask. You've got to ask a lot of questions. I don't know how familiar you are with the five whys, but there's a good concept there called the five whys. But when you're with a customer, ask what their pain points are, ask what their unmet needs are, ask what their frustrations are, ask what they would recommend changing, ask them to put themselves into your
Yep.
mindset or your role. What would you do differently at our company? How can I support you? How can I collaborate with you more effectively? Not many businesses go to that length of asking for guidance. What new
Yep.
products, what new services, what new end markets should we be in? How can we help you be more efficient and more effective in your job? Sometimes they'll have crazy ideas that have absolutely nothing to do with what you do. Okay, fine, toss that out. But sometimes they'll suggest something and you say, well, wait a second. We were just talking about something very similar to that with another customer, and that causes you to realize, wait a second, I wonder how much of an opportunity there is for us if we invested in creating this new technology that at least two customers are asking for. Maybe it would be
Yep.
worthwhile to explore that. And
Yep.
then you get into, okay, well, Mr. Customer, what would it be worth it to you if we were to provide something like that? And tailored it to your particular need. So that's where you can sort of open up. And in a minute ago, I said that's what enables you to make more profit. Now of course, that's not all that is required to create more
Right.
profit. You have to be more efficient as well. But um, certainly, what you're describing makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I'm listening, I'm hearing how important it is for the selling organization to be curious about the buying organization's world and to facilitate the conversation so that both parties start to come up with a common language. Because I've found so often sellers are doing something, if buyers understood what the seller was saying, the buyer would be all excited, but they don't have a common way to look at the problem or to communicate the problem. And so the seller assumes the buyer gets it, and the buyer assumes the seller doesn't get it, and they don't end up creating mutual value.
Yeah, and I'll give you a kind of a ridiculous, fictitious scenario to kind of pound the point home. That something as simple as asking, how do you choose suppliers? When you go about making that decision, what are the factors that come into play? In other words, is it delivery time? Is it responsiveness? Is it customer service? Is it the quality of the material? Is it the product being a right fit? Tell us more about how you
Yep.
do, what's the rank order? Or, if you had to allocate 100 points across all those factors that come into play, how do they shake out, and what's number one, and so on and so forth. And so it could be in some cases we've seen scenarios in which a customer is making a nice shiny metallic product because they think that's what the customer wants, and they have to go to great lengths to make that nice shiny red metallic product, and then the customer takes it and they scrape all the paint off on their own, and they dull it because they're adding their own coating on it or whatever. And that conversation just never took place. So the supplier is spending money to make something pretty and shiny. The customer is spending money to make it dull so they can add their own coatings, and the two never even talked about it. And that happens a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Very good example. One of the things we find doesn't always live in the real world, and that is the recognition that when you transfer value, uh, your business model often has as much value, or in some cases more value, than your product or service. It's how you engage and how you hear what your buyer wants and you match up, or you bring things they don't even see they need and help them understand it, so that it's not just the spec sheet of your product or service. It goes how you partner or how you collaborate, or how you work together to create a bigger pie. So
Yeah, and sometimes channel partners come into play as well. So it's not only the conversations that you could have with your actual customers, but in some cases, there are channels of distribution and channel partners, and their, alliances and relationships that you have. And, getting into that conversation with all of them to really understand and kind of walk the walk of that partner or that customer, to understand, like, what are you doing here? Like, what's happening inside this building where you're making things? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? And if you can get inside their brain and understand their process that much better, there may be ways for you to provide a service or provide a product that is a better fit than what you are
yep,
today, that might command a higher price. And by the way, in addition to that, it might engender higher levels of loyalty
yep,
and respect, even though the customer is paying more. Why? Because they're getting more value out
yep,
of that relationship. Yeah.
yep. Yeah, that's a couple parts of that that are really interesting. One is we ask, our clients to think about when somebody starts talking about money, we suggest that you ask your prospect, do they want the lowest price or the lowest cost? And sometimes they have no idea what you're asking them. But if they don't, that's your opportunity to talk about all those things you were just mentioning, where I can bring this value to you, which will absolutely lower your cost, but it will increase your price. Or, we can leave all that stuff out and we can give you a lower price, but then you got to add all this other stuff back in on your side of the table. And so
Right.
that's one that, it's just a simple, basic question. And we ought to know what the person sitting across from us really cares about. And the other one that you brought in there that we typically don't recognize is how critical our partners are, whether they're development partners, channel partners. They are representing or actually helping create our brand. and they're absolutely impacting the value we do or don't transfer. And
Mhm.
that they need to be, again, part of that context that we're intentionally thinking about. Otherwise, they can either make things worse or hopefully, if they're the right partners and we brought them on board right, they make things a whole lot better.
Right, right.
So, Kit, as you look, you mentioned you've been doing this for a little while. As you look forward, the first question is AI playing in all this, and how does AI impact, your bench strength and, your approach to the talent that you represent or that you partner with to come in and make a difference? How's AI playing in this today?
Well, that's a really wide open question. So I'm not going to do this justice, but what I will say is literally every day on LinkedIn, I see somebody else posting a list of resources or tools or, you know, prompts, and it's changing daily. And so where we're heading is, eventually every industry, every role will have its own, agent, for lack of a better word, its own tool, its own AI tool to enable you, whether you're an executive assistant or somebody on the shop floor or a chief executive officer. You'll have your own. I'll say agent, but really what it means is your own assistant to help you do your job more effectively. So imagine being, you mentioned Strategic Growth Council and peer
Yep.
network, peer collaboration, and Vistage. So we have Strategic Growth Council, which is similar to Vistage. And the reason people join is because they acknowledge that they have questions, they
Yep.
have quandaries, they have concerns, they have challenges on the job. Maybe it's an idea, maybe it's an opportunity, and before AI, who are you going to turn to if it's a urgent enough and important enough question or concern or up at night dilemma? Then you would obviously go to the board. If the factory's on fire, the first
Yep.
call is probably going to be to the fire station, and the second call is going to be to the board of directors, right? But if it's not quite that urgent and important, but it does cause you to lose a little bit of sleep over it, who are you going to turn to? Maybe you've got a coach, maybe you've got a mentor. But beyond that, there's not a lot of resources. And so that's the reason that we have the peer advisory groups. Now, AI is fantastic because, you know, regardless of how we define it, let's just think of it as a friend that you can turn to and ask for advice, right? And that advice is not uh, what's the right word? It's not, if you ask advice from your attorney or your
Yeah.
accountant, the first, or your banker or whomever, the first thing they're going to think about is, how can I answer this question in a way that's going to benefit me in my relationship with Rick or with Kit, right? But if you turn to AI and ask for advice, it's going to be objective, it's going to be unbiased, it's going to be
Yep.
sourced from the universe, and you'll get better inputs. So I don't really have a better answer to your question than that, but it's evolving so rapidly. I think people who take advantage of AI and the tools and agents and so forth are at a substantial advantage over those that are not, just because of what I just said. You're getting
Yep.
free advice,
Yeah.
which is actually quite valuable.
And you don't have to be embarrassed because you're asking.
Right. And that's an interesting, observation. I don't know whether your listeners would care about this, but it is a funny story. So somebody gave me the opportunity to be surveyed or be interviewed. Kind of think about it as an expert interview.
Yeah.
So I was the expert and I was interviewed by an AI agent that had a voice and that it was able to call in using what appeared to be just a normal phone number. And if I hadn't been
Yeah.
pre-screened and forewarned and so forth, I would have absolutely no idea that it was not a real live human being. But that conversation was really interesting because what I discovered is, just as you said, you don't have that awkward feeling about asking a stupid question.
Yeah.
I was sharing much more than I might have if I'd known, okay, now who is this person and where do they work and what are they doing and what are you going to do with this information?
Yeah.
Maybe it's just me, but I kind of sense that a lot of people who were given the opportunity to chat with an AI agent would be more forthcoming probably than they would be with a human because it's just like, ow, maybe we'll get more sophisticated in
Yeah.
the future. Maybe we'll play this back in a couple of years and say, Kit was such a fool.
Well, yeah, I hadn't thought about it quite that way, but when the agent calls, you you don't have the same definition of trust or risk that you have if it's another human, because the other human can have some um, maybe very self-serving or even illegal things going on in their head where the AI's got whatever the AI's got, and it's not they're plotting against you. They're just asking you some kind of science-based question. So I have two more things I want to ask, and we're running out of time, and I'm really enjoying this. First one is tell us what you do today and what we could who should be your customer and how can you help them, and what should that look like today?
Well, I serve the ecosystem that we can refer to as private equity. So to me, that's a big, broad umbrella term that is really a continuum from angel investors and private and venture capital at one end of the spectrum to growth buyout stage private equity groups at the other end of the spectrum. And they have three challenges, and we're trying to solve or help them with maybe two out of three. Their first big challenge is they need money. So they have to get limited partners to commit their capital to their particular fund, right? We can't really help with that. So we'll toss that one out. The second thing that they need are deals. So they need business owners who would be willing to talk to them about, a potential investment. It doesn't have to be a full outright acquisition. It could just be, they're acquiring even a minority stake in the business. So they need that, and we can help with that. So that's, I guess, ask number one, Rick, is if anybody listening has a business that they're contemplating, maybe at some point in the future, we're going to need to sell, we can help prepare for a potential future sale event, and maybe even introduce a private equity group. The third big challenge that private equity groups face is after they bought a business, they typically need to improve the management team. They need to up their game. So they need to find the right talent for that particular situation and that particular value creation strategy. So if the value creation strategy, for example, involves having a really high-powered chief revenue officer, but the business doesn't have one, my hope is that they can source that particular executive from our pool of cultivated, curated talent. Kind of, it's sort of a collective called the operators. So if anybody is aware of either private equity groups, business owners that might be considering potentially selling, or executives that would be interested in working inside a private equity backed business, those are the three things that we're always looking for.
As an observer after this call today, I would think there's a fourth thing that you actually do help with, whether people are looking for it or not, and that is, I would guess you make the exit better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in two different ways. So you mentioned Aclaro Growth Partners, and I did as well. So that's the consulting firm that I founded. And they do a lot of work with investment banks on what is called a sell side market study. But before the investment bank even gets involved, or at least before they start rolling up their sleeves, sometimes there's some work that needs to happen to help the management team develop their clear strategy.
Yep.
So sometimes the investment banks will introduce us to a company that's getting prepared and getting ready, and they just need a little help getting their, I don't want to say getting their act together, but making sure they
Sure.
dot the I's, cross the T's, and figure
Yep.
out like where their value proposition is, where their focus should be, where's the priority. So we do that. And then within the operators, one of the levers, remember I mentioned 11 value creation levers. Well, one of them is preparing to exit. So it's work in and of itself, just leading the business towards that process.
So, last question for you. What should, um, in your case, the talent that's out there that either is already working in private equity or is working in a company that private equity is likely to, want to make investments in, what should that talent be thinking about that maybe they're not thinking about today? And what should the private equity or investor groups who are on the path for finding investments that make sense, what should each of those be thinking about that maybe they're not?
Hmm. Well, that's a really good question, Rick. Um, so let's start with what I think is the easier side of the equation, and that is the private equity groups themselves. What should they be thinking about? Um, there are a lot of really, really good, compelling aspects of private equity. If we had to make a list of, what does private equity do that's good? There's a long list of things. If you can make a business more efficient, more profitable, you're basically providing more security for, the people who work at that company that they're going to have a job for, that much longer. They're paying taxes and they're building businesses that are more profitable. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. But the downside of private equity is they're typically focused really only on the numbers, mainly on the numbers. It wasn't fair to say only, mainly on the numbers. And so the compassion, the understanding, the permission to fail, which is a big buzzword of mine, permission to fail. That means we're learning. That
Yep.
means we're gaining better judgment through experience, right? So in the Army, we have after action reviews. That acceptance, awareness, understanding, the people aspect of it within private equity is not yet fully developed. About 10 years ago, the chief people officer, chief human resources officer, or head of talent in private equity became a thing. And it's grown very rapidly over the last 10 years. So private equity is getting better at that, but there's still a long ways to go within the world of private equity and just showing empathy and understanding in people, maybe having a little bit more patience, maybe developing people, developing talent from within instead of just saying, well, this person's not cutting it. We'll get rid of them and find somebody else in here who is. That's sometimes not the best, most efficient way to improve the company is just by firing somebody and then hoping that they get somebody in a reasonable period of time who's going to perform. On the operator side, I guess maybe it depends on the situation. If it's someone who's never worked in a private equity backed business before and suddenly they're sort of thrown into the deep end, my advice in that particular scenario is if you're thrown into the deep end, start swimming. You know, there's a tendency to sort of look around and say, okay, what's going on here? What's happening? And you can sort things out, but you've got to start swimming while you're sorting things out. Show some quick wins, communicate, make progress, communicate those quick wins again, ask questions, show interest. It's a sprint. It's not a marathon. It's a sprint. So whether you like it or not, you've just entered a
Yes.
sprint in your swim lane, and you're going to have to collaborate with others at the same time. So I don't know if that answered your question, Rick, but that's what occurred to me.
I think that's spot on. And the recognition that it's a sprint, just my observation with people we've dealt with, often that's really, really hard for those who haven't been in private equity funded businesses before and go in with an acquisition or some other way and they realize they're in a sprint, or maybe they never realize they're in a sprint, and it's really a hard place for them.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's a mindset. It's a mindset of recognizing that we're not here to continue business as usual, even though things might have functioned well and there might have been profit and you might have had a job for a long time, that's not good enough.
Right.
So now we're in the game of let's make things better than they ever were before, and then and maybe better than you ever imagined they could be. And to do that, it's going to require a little bit of destruction. It might get messy for a little bit, um, but I just heard a podcast just yesterday in which there were a couple ex-Navy SEALs, and they were talking about being a good Navy SEAL means looking for work. And then they went on to elaborate on that. And it really resonated with me. I really liked it. Basically, don't be comfortable. Don't
Yeah.
just stand around just assuming that everything is good. Look for things to improve. Look for things to fix. Look for people to help. Look for ways to collaborate. And that's the mindset that you have to have in a private equity backed business.
Yeah. Oh, that's Kit. This has been terrific. I really I think our audience is going to get a lot from this, and you've certainly given me a lot to think about. And I want to thank you for being here today. This has been great.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. This was fun for me as well, and I'm looking forward to diving into your book.
Oh, good, good. For those of you in the audience, I think this is one of the real good ones, and I hope you enjoy it. And you've got Kit's information, so I'm sure he won't mind if you fit those groups that he helps. That if you reach out and have a conversation with him, I think it would be very worth your while. And I hope to see you in a couple of weeks when our next one rolls out. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care.